Welcome to the 312th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with Daniel M. Ford, author of the new crime novel, Cheap Heat. Stay tuned for the interview. If you're new to audiobooks, they're the perfect way to get more books into your busy life. Listen to audiobooks during your commute, while doing chores, walking the dog, or just relaxing at home. All you need is a smartphone and the free Libro.fm app. If you already love audiobooks and don't know what to listen to next, check out recommendations and curated lists from people who know audiobooks best, your local bookseller. Reading and Writing Podcast special offer: get 2 audiobooks for the price of 1 with your first month of membership with code RWPodcast. That's code RWPodcast for 2 audiobooks for the price of 1 for your first month of membership at Libro.fm. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Daniel M. Ford, the author of the new novel, Cheap Heat. Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Sure. Well, if someone listening hasn't heard about your new novel, Cheap Heat, yet, how would you describe the novel?
I would describe it as an unprepared private investigator turns bodyguard for a wrestler on the independent circuit in the Mid-Atlantic, and is not ready for the challenges he's going to face.
And is there something about the private eye genre that appealed to you?
Yeah, I've read the private eye genre on and off since I was, I don't know, maybe 15 or so. I think I picked up my first Spencer novel by Robert B. Parker. Mm-hmm. And so I think I've read all of the Spencer novels, including the continuation of the series by Ace Atkins. It tends to be a formulaic genre, and I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel with Jack Dixon. I sort of just wanted to see if I could do it.
And do you remember the original idea that led you to write Cheap Heat?
So I remember the original idea that led to me writing the Jack Dixon series, which Cheap Heat's the second book.
Right.
So I can't say specifically why I decided to have Jack enter the world of regional professional wrestling. But I had been writing fantasy for so dedicatedly for 8 straight years, more or less, and my brain was kind of stuck there and I couldn't break out of a rut, and I was having productivity problems. And I had this thought of, what if I have a guy who lives on a houseboat in a real place I'm very familiar with, in the region I grew up in and still live in and work in. And so that sort of became a private eye because that was the easiest thing to lend itself to that solitary, first person narrator life.
Sure. And so, what was it, or how was it making the transition from fantasy to the private eye genre?
In some ways, it was really refreshing because I didn't have to invent places. Since I set Jack Dixon, like I said, around where I grew up and where I work in Cecil County, Maryland, I didn't have to come up with like an imagined landscape. I could have them go to real places. A lot of them are imagined anyway because you don't want to create a mob owned. You don't want to name a real restaurant in a real town and say the mob owns it, right? So. You don't want to name a real school and say it's corrupt and run for the benefit of, the rich kids that go there. Especially not because I teach at a private school in Cecil County. I didn't want people to get that impression. So in some ways it's refreshing. I don't have to make up languages. I don't have to make up imagined landscapes. In other ways, it's a challenge to suddenly realize you can't use magic to fix any plot holes anymore. You can't use magic to fix any problems. You have to be a little more aware of things like the law and how violence is actually regarded in a real 21st century society, and that you can't go around enforcing your will by just sort of overwhelming anybody who disagrees with you. Right.
So what are your earliest memories of reading in books and then later writing your own fiction?
So my earliest memory of books, there's probably two. One is my dad reading me The Hobbit when I was either 3 or 4. I was very young, and I had the chicken pox over like Easter. And my dad read The Hobbit to me then. So that's fell in love with the fantasy genre. I also remember reading a lot of, if you remember the old like storybooks that would come with a cassette tape, and it was like a storybook of a movie that also had a cassette tape that you could listen to and read the book.
Yep,
that would have pictures of the movie. I remember having the Return of the Jedi storybook with cassette, and I think Raiders of the Lost Ark. And I actually memorized them from listening to the cassette tapes. And then the first time I can remember trying to write my own fiction, I think I was 11. And I was essentially writing fan fiction for a video game that I played called Knights of Legend.
Mm-hmm. And so I know you have an MFA from George Mason University. How did your MFA impact your fiction writing?
Well, my MFA is in poetry, actually, so it's hard to say how it does. Certainly doing an MFA in poetry at George Mason with the poets I got to study with there made me a lot more aware of language, and especially the sonic qualities of language and how things sound when they are spoken aloud than I would be otherwise.
And go ahead.
Go on. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, were you writing fiction or trying to write fiction while you're also doing your MFA in poetry? Only
very little bits. I had a story that I was sending back and forth with a friend of mine that hasn't really gone anywhere, and I wrote a couple of short stories that are sort of in a proto vein of the world that wound up being in the Paladin trilogy. But mostly I was concentrated on writing poems, right? Because you got to produce work and write a thesis.
Right. And so what was the path to publication for you for your first novel?
It was seeing a friend of mine, the really great fiction writer, Rian Amilcar Scott, let me know on Facebook that SFWP, the Santa Fe Writers Project, which is located in Bethesda, Maryland. I know that. Santa Fe Writers Project, Bethesda, Maryland. But did an open call for fantasy manuscripts. And at that point, I was almost done with the first draft of the second book in the Paladin trilogy. So, and I had been through the draft of the first book of Ordination a few times and revised it a few times. So I sent it to their open call. I sent it to that slush pile. And it just rose up through the slush pile after about 9 months. The publisher, Andrew Gifford, read it. And so I guess I started writing it in 2011. I sold it in December of 2014, I want to say, and it came out in the summer of 2016.
And so what is your writing process when you're working on a novel? Do you plot and outline your novels extensively, or do you write more organically?
All 5 of my published novels so far have been written totally by the seat of the pants writing. Totally, I don't know what's happening on page 21 or on page 25 till I'm on page 21. And I keep writing, I keep adding to the story without allowing myself to revise or fix anything until I get to the end of a first draft. Then I open that first draft up and I revise it line by line as many times as I have to, and fix all the plot holes and fix all the things that didn't make sense and fix all the continuity errors. And when I named a character 3 different things, or when I gave a character 2 different eye colors, throughout the book,
sure.
Up to and including forgetting that I killed this character on page 30 and here they are on page 75.
And how many drafts do you think that you end up doing?
I would say total at least probably 4 or 5 from top to bottom, but there's other parts of the book that get revised a lot more than that.
Right.
The opening of, because usually when you're, soliciting agents or publishers, it's, the first 10 pages, the first 25 pages, the first 50 pages. I would say the first 50 pages of Ordination, I rewrote that. It is not an exaggeration to say I rewrote or revised that extensively, probably 25 times.
And what were the changes in those 25 drafts? What were you trying to get to?
I was trying to get to an opening that would grab people faster, right? They say you got to get them in the first, well, it depends on who you ask,
right?
Who they are, the first 5 pages or the first page or the first chapter. And the very opening chapter of Ordination, the prologue, are actually scenes that I initially wrote at the end of Ordination. They were the end of the book. And I decided they worked better if I moved them to the front, and instead of being a sort of a villain reacting to things the character had done throughout the book, it was the villain more in the vein of predicting the things that the protagonist was going to do throughout the book. And I think that made it a lot more interesting.
Interesting. So what advice would you offer for listeners who are writing their own stories and novels?
I don't think this is an original statement, but I don't know who originally said it. The muse shows up when you're already working, right? If you sit and wait for inspiration, it's probably not going to come. But if you try to make a schedule and you adhere to it and you get yourself to your desk or wherever it is you write, whether you're writing, by hand or the laptop or a typewriter, if you make yourself do that, I try to go for 5 to 6 days a week, at least 2 hours at a time. But, you can't necessarily jump right to that level. But if the more you're able to show up and work, the more it will happen. The creative brain's like any other muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it's going to get.
You mentioned earlier Robert B. Parker. I'm curious, are there writers or books that you go back to that inspire your own fiction writing?
So I definitely reread The Lord of the Rings and Tolkien, probably more frequently than anything else. I occasionally reread certain of Robert B. Parker or Terry Pratchett novels that I really like not the whole series, because the entire Discworld series, the entire Spencer series are both like over 40 books. But I will pick out individual ones that I really love. Night Watch for Terry Pratchett, Judas Goat, there's a couple others for Parker, but I'm struggling to think of the titles. Sure. Catskill Eagle is pretty good. And I reread Ursula Le Guin a lot, especially the first 2 books of Earthsea. And who else do I reread a lot? I've been trying to do less rereading lately just because I realized there's so many books I haven't already read.
Right.
Who I reread a lot is the comic book writer Larry Hama. And for someone with an MFA, I don't know if that's an odd choice. But the bulk of what he wrote was the G.I. Joe comic series of the 1980s, which you'd think is just, hackery meant to sell toys. And maybe that's how Marvel intended it. But you can tell that Larry Hama always approached it from a character-driven perspective. And he was trying to make these toy characters feel like real people with real emotions and real relationships. And I think I reread those comics occasionally when I feel like I need some recharging on the characterization front.
And so what books have you read recently, fiction or nonfiction, that you would recommend?
I just finished reading the first book of the Fetch Phillips series by Luke Arnold, who is an actor. He's in the series Black Sails. He started as Long John Silver in that, which I'm also watching and really enjoying. But I found out he wrote it's a private detective novel, but set in a fantasy world. It's called The Last Smile in Sunder City, and I just finished it last night. If you like both of those genres, and obviously I do because I write both of those genres, I'd really recommend it. It's sort of a little bit of a grim, dark fantasy world, but it very identifiably plays with the trope of the private detective in the sort of Marlowe Spencer style, set in a world that used to be very magical and filled with every single kind of magical race and creature you can imagine.
Interesting. So, in the mini drafts that you mentioned of the first book in the Paladin trilogy and the writing that you've done in your 2 books of private eye fiction, what for you was the biggest thing for you to learn in terms of a fiction writer? Do you feel like?
So I would say that the biggest thing for me has been the discipline of sticking with it, right? Of continuing to work at the book until you make it the best book that you can make it. And then once you have the luxury of professional editing, or you have an agent, understanding that at that point it's going to become an even better book than you could make it on your own. But there's just a certain amount of, I am not going to stop working on this until somebody makes me. Until someone physically prevents me from continuing to do this, because it's a tough road to publication. And you can self-publish, but it's a tough road to do that well, maybe even tougher in some ways. And you just have to keep reminding yourself that the only person who can really stop you from doing it is you, right? You're the only person who can decide when it's done, and I'm not gonna spend my time on this anymore.
Right. So where can people find you online if they're interested in learning more about you and your books?
On Twitter at Sounding Line. That's an old nautical term. I don't know why that's my Twitter handle, but it is. All one word. And then DanielMFord.com. Always happy to hear from readers. Always happy to answer questions unless I can't because it's a spoiler for a next book or a sequel series or something. Those are the main places.
Great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Daniel M. Ford, author of the new novel Cheap Heat. Go buy a copy of the novel now. And Daniel, thanks for doing this interview.
Thanks for having me.
Great.